Tiffany Henyard, a cautionary tale of unchecked power and political decline once hailed as the super mayor of Dalton, Illinois. Tiffany Henyard's meteoric rise in local politics has now given way to a stunning and dramatic downfall. Once celebrated for her bold leadership and ambitious promises of change, Henyard is now at the center of a growing storm of allegations, including reckless spending, ethical misconduct, and divisive leadership that has alienated both supporters and critics alike. Henyard's fall from grace has been swift and public. Reports have surfaced alleging that funds earmarked for public services were instead funneled toward extravagant personal luxuries, including lavish parties, first-class travel, and costly hotel stays. While Henyard has defended these expenses as necessary for official duties, critics argue they reveal gross mismanagement and a troubling disregard for the needs of Dalton's largely low-income residents who depend on these very services. Her leadership style, once viewed as assertive and trailblazing, is now widely criticized as autocratic and exclusionary. Henyard is accused of filling her administration with loyalists lacking qualifications, transforming what was once considered a beacon of reform into what some call a personal fiefdom. Tensions between her office and the town's board escalated over budgetary conflicts and controversial appointments. Most notably, the installation of a police chief whose selection drew significant backlash. These clashes only worsened public skepticism, casting doubt on her ability to lead effectively. Even Henyard's staunchest allies began distancing themselves as the scandals multiplied and ethical questions mounted. What had once been praised as bold rhetoric is now perceived as combative and alienating. Her refusal to engage in meaningful dialogue with constituents further deepened the chasm between her administration and the community, eroding public trust that had once been firmly in her grasp. The disappointment was especially acute given the optimism that once surrounded her leadership. Henyard had inspired many with her promises of revitalization and empowerment, but over time, that hopeful vision faded. Her handling of criticism, once a mark of resilience, evolved into stubbornness as she dismissed legitimate concerns and doubled down on controversial decisions. Her increasingly defensive posture not only silenced opposition, but also pushed away those who once championed her cause, as allegations of excessive spending, lack of transparency, and failure to address critical issues in Dalton and Thornton Township continued to pile up. Public frustration reached a boiling point. Basic services suffered while resources were diverted elsewhere, and Henyard's refusal to confront the realities of her administration's shortcomings became impossible to ignore. Rather than seeking solutions, she adopted a siege mentality, insisting on her righteousness even as the evidence mounted against her. The final blow came in the form of a significant caucus defeat, a symbolic and literal rejection of Henyard's leadership. What had once seemed like a stronghold of political dominance collapsed under the weight of unmet promises and growing disillusionment. Her inability to take responsibility and reconnect with the public proved to be a fatal flaw. The electorate's message was clear. The community was ready for change, and Henyard no longer represented the future they envisioned. Despite her unraveling political fortunes, Henyard and her most loyal supporters have continued to challenge the legitimacy of the processes that led to her downfall. They claim the system was rigged against her and have refused to fully accept the outcome. But for many in Dalton and Thornton Township, the writing is on the wall. Her era has come to a close. To understand the magnitude of Henyard's decline, it's important to remember the scale of her rise. She once stood as a symbol of possibility and resilience, a rising star in local politics who many believed would lead her community into a better future. But ambition, unchecked by responsibility, and power divorced from accountability, ultimately led her down a path of self-destruction. Tiffany Henyard's political career now serves as a cautionary tale. A once promising leader brought low by mismanagement, arrogance, and a failure to serve the very people who entrusted her with power. Tiffany Henyard. The rise and fall of a once promising leader. Tiffany Henyard's dual roles as mayor of Dalton and supervisor of Thornton Township once positioned her as one of the most influential political figures in the region. Her blend of authority, strength, and vision led many to believe she was a transformative leader, capable of bringing much-needed change to her community. However, as her power grew, so too did the cracks in her carefully managed public image. The contrast between Henyard's rising influence and the financial struggles of the very people she was elected to serve quickly became a point of contention. One of the most damning revelations was an alleged $33,000 charge to Amazon, reportedly for community purposes in Dalton. In a town where the median income hovers around $50,000 and many residents live paycheck to paycheck, such a staggering expense sparked outrage. The lavish spending, coupled with Henyard's growing detachment from the realities of her constituents, shifted public reception dramatically. Many residents, once firm believers in her leadership, began to feel betrayed. As one community member put it, "It's disgusting that she's living like a queen while we can barely get by." These sentiments capture the growing frustration of a community that felt abandoned by a leader who had once promised to fight for them. What had been touted as responsible governance quickly unraveled into a story of extravagance, excess, and mismanagement. As scrutiny intensified, the gap between Henyard's rhetoric and her actions became impossible to ignore. The once celebrated image of fiscal prudence gave way to accusations of hypocrisy, painting Henyard as a leader more invested in personal luxury than in community progress. The financial mismanagement didn't just raise questions. It shook the foundation of trust that had underpinned her support. The fallout was swift and severe. Her reputation, once built on professionalism and the promise of transformation, took a significant hit. Many early supporters began to distance themselves, reassessing their belief in her vision. What had been seen as the bold leadership of a rising star now looked, to many, like a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition and self-interest. Henyard's fall from grace was particularly jarring given the optimism that had surrounded her rise. She had entered politics on a wave of enthusiasm, promising reform, transparency, and a deep commitment to the people she served. Instead, her tenure had become emblematic of the very problems she vowed to fix: inequity, irresponsibility, and a disconnect between leadership and the lived experiences of everyday residents. Her critics argue that Henyard's pursuit of power ultimately eclipsed her duty to the public. Allegations of misused funds and a leadership style increasingly viewed as dismissive and offensive only deepened public disillusionment. What was once seen as visionary now appears to have been fueled by personal ambition rather than genuine service. Tiffany Henyard's political demise stands as a stark warning about the dangers of unbridled power and leadership divorced from accountability. Once regarded as a symbol of hope and progress, she now serves as a cautionary example of how quickly ambition can spiral into controversy when detached from the needs of the people. Her story, once one a promise, has become a powerful reminder that true leadership demands not just vision, but integrity, humility, and unwavering service to the community. Tiffany Henyard. From promising reformer to political pariah, Tiffany Henyard appeared poised to usher in a new era of progress when she assumed leadership as mayor of Dalton and supervisor of Thornton Township. Her early rise was marked by ambition, confidence, and a bold vision for change. But what began as a promising political journey soon unraveled into a troubling saga of financial mismanagement, political turmoil, and a growing rift between her administration and the very community she vowed to uplift. Early optimism faded quickly as Henyard's leadership came under scrutiny for excessive spending and an apparent disconnect from the realities facing her constituents. Dalton residents, once hopeful, began to voice their frustration as essential services deteriorated and critical projects stalled. Instead of focusing on the community's needs, Henyard increasingly became embroiled in political infighting, turning what should have been an era of collaboration into a bitter tug-of-war that stalled progress and deepened public distrust. One of the most glaring examples of her financial missteps was a $33,000 charge to Amazon, allegedly for community-related purposes. In a town where many residents struggled to get by on modest incomes, this spending was seen as extravagant and out of touch. The backlash was swift and intense, with residents and watchdogs questioning whether Henyard's priorities aligned with the community's well-being. Calls for greater accountability grew louder, but Henyard remained defiant. Rather than taking responsibility, she dismissed criticism and refused to engage in open dialogue with constituents. Her evasive responses only fueled further disillusionment, even among her previous supporters. What had once been hailed as visionary leadership was increasingly viewed as a power play driven more by personal ambition than a genuine desire to serve. The situation reached a boiling point during her bid for Thornton Township supervisor. At a critical campaign event, Henyard abruptly left just 7 minutes in, sparking outrage and confusion. According to community advocate Stephanie Wheatman, the failure to obtain necessary permits for the event could cost the township up to $40,000, funds that were desperately needed for local projects. The incident not only exposed poor planning, but also raised concerns that taxpayers might be forced to repay misallocated funds as public frustration mounted. Henyard's leadership style, seen by many as overly controlling, led to internal strife. Staff resignations and reports of dissatisfaction within her administration signaled a government in disarray. The damage to her reputation was further compounded by an ongoing FBI investigation into her administration, which, while not resulting in formal charges, delivered a crushing blow to her political credibility. Her once loyal inner circle began to fracture, and key allies publicly distanced themselves. In an attempt to reclaim control of the narrative, Henyard posted a defiant video to Facebook accusing her critics of orchestrating a smear campaign. But instead of rallying support, the video was met with ridicule. Media outlets and community members alike saw the move as desperate and out of touch, a tone-deaf response to the real concerns of her constituents with every controversy. From stalled community projects to rising internal tensions, her political future grew more precarious. Her attempt to shift public opinion through media appearances and public events backfired, often being labeled as insincere and poorly executed. Once seen as a symbol of strength and determination, Henyard now found herself a subject of public mockery and political isolation as her administration collapsed under the weight of scandals, unmet promises, and a failure to reconnect with the people. It became clear that Henyard's political career was nearing its end. What had started as a bold vision for change became a cautionary tale of ambition unchecked by accountability. Her inability to balance power with responsibility, to prioritize the needs of the people over personal pursuits, sealed her fate. Tiffany Henyard's legacy will likely be remembered not for the progress she once promised, but for the opportunities lost under her watch, and the deep mistrust her leadership left behind.